Lightning cracked across the sky, and Mira Lang was already running before the thunder finished rolling through the valley. Rain hit her face like small stones, and the wind tore at her jacket as she pushed through the wet branches of the forest. Somewhere ahead of her, buried under the roar of the storm, she had heard something that made her blood turn cold. A cry. Small, broken, desperate, the kind of sound that no person could ignore, no matter how much danger waited in the dark. She had grown up in Hallowmere, a small village pressed against the edge of an old forest that the locals called Wolf Ridge. Nobody went there after sunset. Nobody went there during storms. The elders told stories about the ridge, about shapes that moved between the trees, that were not quite animal and not quite human, about a silence so complete that it swallowed sound whole. Mira had always listened to those stories, with a curious kind of doubt. She loved animals more than she feared legends. She had spent 5 years working with the Regional Wildlife Rescue Center, patching broken wings, feeding orphaned foxes, and driving for hours in the middle of the night whenever someone called about an injured deer on the roadside. Fear had never stopped her before, and it was not going to stop her now. The cry came again, closer this time, thin and shaking, swallowed almost instantly by the wind. Mira changed direction, moving deeper into the tree line, her flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through sheets of rain. Her boots sank into mud with every step. Cold water ran down the back of her neck. She should have turned back the moment the storm hit, should have listened to the warning she had felt crawling up her spine since she left the village gate behind her, but something about that sound pulled her forward, like a rope tied around her chest. The trees grew thicker here, old and twisted, their branches locking together overhead until the sky disappeared completely. The wind dropped, but the rain still found its way through the canopy in long, cold streams. Mira slowed her pace, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the drumming of water on leaves and the distant groan of a bending trunk. Then she heard it again, weaker now, coming from somewhere to her left. She pushed through a wall of wet ferns and found herself in a small clearing where a massive tree had fallen, its roots torn from the earth and pointing toward the sky like broken fingers. Pinned beneath one of its heavy branches was a wolf cub, no more than a few weeks old, its gray fur soaked and matted with mud. Its side rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. When it saw Mira, it tried to pull away, but the branch held it firmly in place, and the effort only made it whimper louder. Mira's heart clenched. She had seen injured animals many times in her work, but there was something about the cub's eyes, wide and shining and frightened, that made this different. She dropped to her knees in the mud beside it, speaking in a low, steady voice, the same voice she used with every frightened creature she had ever helped. "It's okay," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to get you out of here." The cub's ears flattened against its skull, but it stopped struggling, as though some instinct told it that fighting would only make things worse. Mira examined the branch. It was thick, slick with rain, and had settled at an angle that pinned the cub's back leg against a root. She tried to lift it with her bare hands first, but it did not move even an inch. She looked around the clearing for something she could use as leverage and spotted a smaller branch nearby, broken but sturdy enough to work as a lever. She wedged the branch beneath the fallen trunk and threw her weight against it, ignoring the way the wet bark bit into her palms. Nothing happened. She adjusted her grip, planted her feet as firmly as she could in the sliding mud, and pushed again, using every bit of strength in her arms and legs. Slowly, painfully, the trunk shifted, just enough to lift the pressure from the cub's leg. The moment it did, she reached in and pulled the small body free, cradling it against her chest, as the trunk settled back down with a heavy, final thud. The cub was trembling violently, its breathing fast and shallow. Mira checked its leg quickly with careful fingers, relieved to find no obvious break, only a deep scrape that had already begun to swell. She unzipped her jacket, still warm from her own body heat despite the rain, and wrapped the cub inside it, tucking it close against her. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, more to herself than to the animal in her arms. "Come on, just a little further." The storm had grown worse while she worked. Thunder rolled overhead in long, continuous waves, and the wind had picked up again, bending the tops of the trees until they groaned. Mira turned back the way she had come, but the clearing looked different now, the landmarks she had used to navigate blurred by rain and darkness. She chose a direction and started walking, her flashlight beam trembling in her cold, shaking hand. Every step became harder than the last. Her boots were heavy with mud, her jeans soaked through and clinging to her legs, and the temperature had dropped sharply since she entered the forest. She had not planned to be out this long. She had left her heavier coat in the car, thinking she would only be gone a few minutes, thinking whatever she heard would turn out to be nothing more than a startled bird or a branch scraping in the wind. She had been wrong about that, and now the mistake was catching up to her. The cub stirred against her chest, letting out a small sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. Mira held it tighter, trying to share what little warmth she had left. Her own body had begun to shake, first in small tremors, and then in longer, harder waves that she could not control. She recognized the signs. She had read about them during her training. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable. It was becoming dangerous. She pressed forward anyway, refusing to stop, refusing to consider turning back for help, because she did not know if the cub had that much time. Her mind began to drift in strange directions, thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. She thought about her mother, who used to tell her that kindness always found its way back to you, even when it did not seem like it in the moment. She thought about the first fox she had ever rescued, half her lifetime ago, and the way its eyes had looked exactly like this cub's eyes did now. She thought about how tired her legs had become, how heavy each step felt, how the trees around her seemed to be tilting slightly no matter how carefully she tried to walk in a straight line. The ground rose beneath her, a small slope she had not noticed in the dark, and her foot caught on a root hidden beneath the wet leaves. She stumbled, caught herself against a tree trunk, and forced herself upright again, gasping. The cub whimpered at the sudden jolt, and she murmured an apology, adjusting her grip carefully so it would not be crushed against her chest. For a brief moment, she had the strange sensation of being watched. It was not something she could explain with logic, only a prickling awareness at the back of her neck, the kind of feeling that made animals freeze mid-step in the wild. She turned her flashlight sharply toward a cluster of trees to her right, half expecting to see eyes reflecting back at her, but there was nothing except rain sliding down dark bark. She told herself it was only nerves, only exhaustion playing tricks on a mind pushed too far past its limits. Still, she quickened her pace, unwilling to linger in one place any longer than she had to. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard a howl. It rose over the sound of the storm, long and clear, carrying something that was almost like sorrow. Mira froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The stories about Wolf Ridge came rushing back to her, unwelcome and vivid. She told herself it was only a wild wolf, calling out through the storm the way animals sometimes did when they sensed danger in the air. She told herself there was nothing more to it than that. But some old instinct in her chest whispered otherwise, and she found herself walking faster, driven now by something beyond simple exhaustion. The rain had begun to turn to sleet, small icy pellets that stung where they struck her exposed skin. Her fingers had gone numb inside her soaked gloves, and she could no longer feel her toes inside her boots. She kept walking anyway, one foot in front of the other, her eyes fixed on the narrow beam of her flashlight as it swept across wet bark and twisted roots. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing closer together the further she went, as though the woods themselves were trying to keep her from finding her way out. She thought about calling for help, but there was no one to call. Her phone had no signal this deep in the forest, and even if it had, she doubted anyone from the village would come looking for her here. Not at this hour, not in this weather, not on Wolf Ridge. She was alone, carrying a fragile life against her chest, walking through a storm that seemed determined to take everything she had left. A memory rose in her mind, unbidden, of the winter she turned 9 years old, when her father had taken her out into the snow to find a lamb that had wandered from their neighbor's field. She remembered how he had told her that courage was not about feeling brave. It was about doing the right thing, even when your whole body was shaking with fear. She had carried that lesson with her through every rescue since, through every late-night call, through every animal too small and too frightened to help itself. She held on to that memory now, using it like a rope to pull herself forward through the storm. The ground began to slope downward, and she realized with a distant kind of alarm that she no longer recognized any part of the forest around her. She had wandered off whatever path she thought she was following, and the trees here grew even closer together, their trunks black and slick with rain. She paused for a moment, trying to get her bearings, turning in a slow circle with her flashlight raised. The beam caught nothing but more trees, more shadows, more rain falling in silver sheets through the darkness. A sound reached her then, low and rhythmic, carried faintly on the wind. It took her a moment to recognize it as running water, and relief flickered through her chest despite her exhaustion. Streams meant paths. Paths meant people had walked this way before. She turned toward the sound and pushed forward, her legs trembling with every step, the cub curled tightly against her chest, its small body shivering in time with her own. She found the stream a few minutes later, wider than she expected, swollen far beyond its normal banks by the storm. The water rushed past in a dark, churning current, carrying broken branches and clumps of leaves downstream, at a speed that made her stomach tighten. She searched along the bank for a place narrow enough to cross, moving carefully over slick stones and tangled roots, aware that one wrong step here could mean losing her footing entirely. She found a spot where a fallen log stretched partway across the water, and beyond it, a cluster of flat stones that looked solid enough to complete the crossing. She hesitated only a moment before stepping onto the log, one arm wrapped securely around the cub, the other stretched out for balance. The wood was slippery beneath her boots, and the sound of the rushing water below made her head spin slightly, but she forced herself to focus on nothing except the next step, and the one after that. Halfway across, her foot slid on a patch of wet moss, and for one terrifying second, she felt herself tipping toward the current. She twisted her body instinctively to protect the cub, taking the fall against her own shoulder instead, landing hard against the log with a jolt that knocked the breath from her lungs. Pain flared along her arm, sharp and immediate, but she held on, gritting her teeth until it passed. The cub let out a frightened cry, and she murmured softly to it, even as she fought to steady herself, forcing her numb fingers to grip the rough bark beneath her. She finished the crossing on hands and knees, refusing to trust her legs any further on the slick wood, and pulled herself onto the muddy bank on the other side, gasping for breath. Her shoulder throbbed where she had struck it, and when she tried to move her arm, sharp pain shot down to her wrist. She forced herself to keep moving anyway, cradling the cub against her uninjured side, pressing forward into the trees once more. The cold had settled so deeply into her body now that she had stopped shivering altogether, and some distant part of her mind recognized this as a warning sign rather than relief. She had read about it once, in a training manual about wilderness survival. When the shivering stops, the body has begun to give up the fight. She tried to quicken her pace, but her legs no longer responded the way she wanted them to, each step slower and less certain than the last. The trees around her seemed to blur together, the darkness pressing in from every direction, until she could barely tell which way she was facing. She thought she heard the howl again, closer this time, weaving through the trees like something alive and searching, but she could no longer be certain whether it was real or only an echo inside her own exhausted mind. She kept walking anyway, driven by nothing more than the small, warm shape still breathing against her chest. Her legs finally began to give out, somewhere near a small clearing beyond the stream, swollen ground soft with rainwater. She stumbled again, this time falling hard onto one knee, the impact sending a jolt of pain through her leg. She stayed there for a moment, breathing hard, the cub shifting weakly inside her jacket. "Get up," she told herself. "You have to get up." But her body had started to feel distant, as though it belonged to someone else, someone who was not quite so cold, not quite so tired. She pushed herself back to her feet, swaying slightly, and continued forward. The world around her had begun to blur at the edges, the shapes of the trees losing their sharpness, the sound of the rain fading into something soft and far away. She recognized this feeling too, distantly, as a warning sign, but understanding it and being able to fight it were two very different things. Strange images began to drift through her mind, disconnected and dreamlike. She saw her mother's kitchen, warm and yellow with lamplight, the smell of bread rising from the oven. She saw the first winter she had spent volunteering at the rescue center, learning to hold a trembling bird still enough to splint its wing, without causing more pain. She saw faces of people she had not thought about in years, blurred at the edges, smiling at her the way people do in dreams rather than in life. She knew, somewhere beneath the haze, that these images were not good signs. She had read about this too, the mind wandering when the body grew too cold to keep it anchored in the present. She tried to shake herself back to awareness, blinking hard against the rain, focusing on the small weight still moving faintly against her chest. The cub had grown quieter, its shivering less violent than before, and for one terrifying moment, she feared the worst. She slowed her steps just enough to press her hand gently against its side, and felt, with overwhelming relief, the faint rise and fall of its breathing. It was still alive. That was enough to keep her moving, one unsteady step after another, through trees that no longer seemed to end. She reached a small clearing where the trees thinned enough to let in a faint gray light, though whether it came from the moon behind the clouds or from something else entirely, she could not tell. Her legs finally refused to carry her any further. She sank to her knees in the wet grass, curling protectively around the cub in her arms, using the last of her strength to shield it from the cold rather than herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. "I tried. I really tried." The cub pressed weakly against her, as though trying to comfort her in return. Mira felt her eyelids grow heavy, felt the cold seep so deeply into her bones that it no longer felt like cold at all, only a strange, distant numbness that pulled her down like a tide. She fought against it for as long as she could, blinking hard, trying to focus on the shapes of the trees around her, trying to remember why it mattered so much to stay awake. But the darkness pressed in from every side, patient and heavy, and eventually, it became too strong to resist. Her last clear thought, before everything faded into black, was of the small heartbeat she could still feel against her chest, faint but steady, and the quiet hope that whatever happened to her, at least that tiny life would somehow survive the night. Somewhere far above the clearing, carried on a gust of wind that swept down from the ridge, a second howl rose into the storm, closer now than before, and this one did not sound like sorrow at all. It sounded like something searching. Cale had felt the disturbance before he understood what it meant. It came as a sharp tug somewhere beneath his ribs, a pull that every wolf in his bloodline recognized instantly, tied to the small cub who carried a piece of his own spirit within her. Something was wrong. He rose from where he had been resting near the den entrance, ignoring the storm raging beyond the rocks, and stepped out into the rain without a second thought. The bond between an alpha and the youngest of his pack ran deeper than most outsiders could ever understand. It was not simply protectiveness, though that was part of it. It was something older, woven into the blood itself, a thread that stretched taut whenever danger came near a cub too young to defend itself. Cale had felt that thread pulled twice before in his life, both times during moments of genuine crisis, and both times the warning had proven correct. He did not intend to ignore it now. He moved through the storm with the ease of someone who had spent his entire existence learning every inch of this forest, weaving between trees that would have blinded a human's sense of direction within minutes. Rain did not slow him. Thunder did not startle him. He ran with his senses stretched wide, listening for the particular cry that belonged to Finn, the smallest and most stubborn cub his pack had welcomed in the past decade. When he finally caught the scent, faint and mixed with something else entirely unexpected, he nearly stopped in his tracks. It was human. The realization should have filled him with suspicion, perhaps even anger. Humans and wolves had shared an uneasy peace across these lands for generations, an agreement built on mutual avoidance rather than trust. Humans stayed out of the deep forest. Wolves stayed out of the villages. It was a fragile balance, maintained through fear as much as respect, and any disruption to it carried consequences that rippled far beyond a single encounter. But underneath that scent of human was something else, something that made the pull in his chest sharpen rather than fade. Finn's scent, faint but unmistakable, tangled together with the stranger's in a way that told him one simple truth before he even reached the clearing. This human had been near his cub, and Finn was not afraid. He broke through the last line of trees and found them together in the open grass, rain falling steadily over both of them. The woman lay curled on her side, unmoving, her arms wrapped protectively around the small shivering form of his cub, even in unconsciousness. Cale approached slowly, every instinct in him sharpening with caution, but as he drew closer, the scene before him only grew stranger. There were no wounds on Finn that suggested an attack. No signs of struggle that indicated a trap, only a woman who had clearly given every last measure of her strength to keep his cub warm and safe, even as the storm stripped that same warmth from her own body. He knelt beside her, ignoring the rain that soaked through his own clothing, and pressed 2 fingers gently to the side of her throat. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his touch, slow and thin, but present. Her skin had gone cold, in a way that worried him more than he wanted to admit. He had seen this before, long ago, during a winter that had claimed lives from villages on the far side of the mountain. He knew what this kind of cold meant, if it was left unanswered for much longer. Finn stirred at the sound of his approach, lifting her head weakly and letting out a small, relieved whimper. Kale reached out and gathered the cub into one arm, checking her over quickly with practiced hands. Beyond the scrape on her leg and the exhaustion evident in her trembling body, she seemed otherwise unharmed. The realization settled into him slowly, heavier than he expected. This woman had found his cub trapped somewhere in the forest, had freed her, had carried her through a storm that would have tested even a seasoned wolf, and had collapsed only after ensuring Finn's survival before her own. He looked down at the unconscious woman for a long moment, rain streaming down both their faces, thunder rolling somewhere far above the canopy. Every instinct told him to leave her here. It was not his place to interfere with human lives, and bringing her into wolf territory would break rules that had stood unquestioned for longer than he had been alive. His pack would not welcome the decision easily. Some among them would see it as reckless, even dangerous, an invitation for the kind of trouble that had cost other packs dearly in the past. But he could not leave her. Not after what she had done for Finn. Not while her pulse still beat, however faintly, beneath skin gone cold from a storm she had walked into for the sake of a creature she had never met before tonight. He shifted Finn carefully against his chest with one arm, and gathered the woman up with the other, surprised at how light she felt, how fragile despite the strength it must have taken to do what she had done. She stirred faintly at the movement, murmuring something too quiet to understand, her head falling naturally against his shoulder as though her body recognized, even unconscious, that she was no longer in danger. Kale turned back toward the den, moving quickly now, aware that every passing minute mattered if he wanted to keep her alive. The journey back felt shorter than the one that had brought him here, driven now by urgency rather than uncertainty. He kept his pace steady despite the weight he carried, weaving through familiar paths with practiced ease, even as rain continued to fall in heavy sheets around them. Finn had fallen still against his chest, exhausted but breathing evenly, and the woman remained unconscious in his other arm, her breath shallow but steady enough to keep the worst of his fear at bay. When he reached the entrance to the den, carved into the side of a hill and hidden behind a curtain of thick vines, two shapes emerged to meet him. Owen, his second in command, moved forward first, his sharp eyes narrowing the moment he took in the sight of the unconscious woman in Kale's arms. Beside him stood Grace, older than most of the pack, her steady presence a source of calm during moments of crisis. She had served as the pack's healer for longer than Kale had been alive, and her expression shifted quickly from surprise to focused concern the moment she understood the situation. "What happened?" Owen asked, his voice tight with barely contained alarm. "Why is there a human here?" "She saved Finn," Kale said simply, stepping past him toward the warmth of the inner den. "She was trapped somewhere near the fallen oak by the ridge. This woman freed her and carried her through the storm. She is dying of cold. I need Grace's help now, not questions." Owen's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, falling into step behind them as they moved deeper into the den. Grace was already ahead, gathering supplies with quick, efficient movements, calling out instructions as she worked. Kale laid the woman down carefully near the fire that burned steadily at the center of the main chamber, and Finn, once released from his arms, immediately curled against the stranger's side, as though refusing to be separated from her again. Grace knelt beside the unconscious woman, pressing careful fingers against her wrist, her throat, the pale skin of her cheek. Her expression grew serious as she worked, murmuring softly to herself in the old language that few among the younger wolves still understood. She called for warm water, for blankets, for the dried herbs kept in careful store along the far wall of the den, and the pack moved quickly to obey, even those who eyed the newcomer with open suspicion. "She is fortunate you found her when you did," Grace said finally, glancing up at Kale. "Any longer out there, and this story would have ended very differently." Kale said nothing, watching as Grace worked to warm the woman's body, layering blankets carefully around her, using heated stones wrapped in cloth to draw the cold from her skin. He found himself unable to look away from her face, pale and still in the firelight, framed by dark hair damp with rain. There was something in her stillness that unsettled him, something that made the weight in his chest feel heavier than simple obligation could explain. Owen lingered near the entrance, arms crossed, his gaze shifting between the fire and the unconscious stranger with obvious unease. "This is a mistake," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough that only Kale would hear. "You know what happens when humans learn the truth about us. You know what happened to the Ashwood pack." "I know," Kale answered, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "But I could not leave her to die in that storm after what she did for Finn. Whatever comes of this decision, I will answer for it myself." Owen studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his sharp eyes, before he finally nodded and stepped back, allowing the matter to rest for now, though clearly not forgotten. Around the chamber, other members of the pack had begun to gather quietly at the edges of the firelight, drawn by curiosity and concern in equal measure, whispering among themselves as they watched the healer work. Hours passed slowly within the den, the storm outside gradually softening into a steady, gentler rain. Grace remained at the woman's side throughout, monitoring her breathing, adjusting the blankets, occasionally pressing warmed stones against her hands and feet to encourage circulation. Finn stayed curled against her the entire time, refusing every attempt to be moved elsewhere, as though some instinct told her that her survival remained tied to the stranger who had saved her. Kale kept his own vigil a short distance away, seated near enough to watch every small change in the woman's condition, though he told himself it was only practical concern, only the natural responsibility of an alpha, ensuring the safety of someone who had risked everything for his pack. He was not entirely certain he believed his own reasoning, but he did not examine the thought too closely. Not yet. Not while there were more immediate matters demanding his attention. As the first hints of gray dawn began to filter faintly through the vines covering the den entrance, the woman's breathing finally deepened, steadying into a slow, natural rhythm. Grace pressed a hand gently against her forehead and nodded with quiet satisfaction. "The worst has passed," she said. "She will wake soon. When she does, she will have many questions." Kale's gaze remained fixed on the woman's face, as the firelight flickered softly across her features. He did not know yet what he would say to her when she woke, did not know how she would react to discovering the truth of where she was and what surrounded her. He only knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that whatever happened next, he intended to see this through to its end, whatever that end might be. Warmth returned to Mira slowly, spreading through her limbs in waves that felt almost painful after the deep cold that had claimed her in the forest. She became aware of firelight before anything else, a soft orange glow flickering against her closed eyelids, and the faint crackle of burning wood somewhere nearby. Her body ached in ways she did not fully understand, a dull throbbing in her shoulder, a rawness in her throat, a heaviness in her limbs that made even the smallest movement feel like an enormous effort. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the light, and found herself staring up at a ceiling of rough stone and packed earth, unlike anything she had ever seen before. For a moment, confusion held her still, her mind struggling to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. Then memory returned in a sudden rush. The storm, the cub, the long, desperate walk through the trees, the cold that had finally pulled her under. She sat up too quickly, and a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her to press a hand against the soft furs beneath her, until the world steadied. When her vision cleared, she found herself in a large chamber carved into what appeared to be the side of a hill, its walls smooth in places and rough in others, decorated with woven blankets and carefully arranged stones. A fire burned in a shallow pit near the center of the room, its light casting long shadows against the curved walls. Beside her, curled against a thick pile of furs, lay the wolf cub she had rescued, sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in steady, healthy rhythm. Relief flooded through Mira at the sight, quickly followed by a fresh wave of confusion. This was not any shelter she recognized, not a cave formed naturally by the mountain, but something clearly shaped and maintained with deliberate care. She noticed woven baskets along one wall, neat rows of dried herbs hanging from wooden pegs, carefully stacked furs and blankets folded with obvious attention to order. Someone lived here. Someone had brought her here, had cared for her, had saved her life. A soft sound from across the chamber drew her attention, and she turned to find a man watching her from where he sat near the entrance, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He was tall, with dark hair that fell loosely around a face marked by sharp, striking features, and eyes so pale they seemed to catch and hold the firelight in a way that made her breath catch slightly in her chest. He wore simple clothing, worn but well kept, and he sat with a stillness that reminded her, oddly, of the way wild animals held themselves when they were assessing whether something posed a threat. "You are awake," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying none of the alarm she might have expected from a stranger discovering an unfamiliar woman in his home. "That is good. We were not certain you would wake at all." Mira's throat felt raw and dry, and it took her a moment to find her voice. "Where am I?" she finally managed, her words rough and uncertain. "You are safe," the man answered, rising slowly from his seat and moving closer, though he stopped a respectful distance away, as though careful not to crowd her. "You collapsed in the forest last night, during the storm. I found you there, along with her." He nodded toward the sleeping cub, and Mira's gaze followed, a fresh wave of relief washing through her at the sight of the small creature breathing peacefully beside her. "She's all right," Mira said softly, more to herself than to him. "I wasn't sure if I made it in time." "You did," the man said. "Because of you, she is alive. My name is Kale. This cub is called Finn. She belongs to my pack." Mira's mind struggled to process his words, snagging on the phrase he had used. Pack. She studied him more closely now, noting details she had missed in her initial confusion. The strange stillness in his posture, the way his pale eyes seemed to track every small movement she made, with an intensity that felt almost predatory. The unfamiliar structure of the space around her, carved rather than built, arranged with a precision that suggested habitation by something other than an ordinary human household. "You're not human," she said slowly, the realization settling over her with a strange mixture of fear and disbelief. "Are you?" Kale's expression did not change, though something in his pale eyes sharpened slightly. "Not entirely," he admitted. "My people have lived in this forest for longer than your village has existed. We are not so different from the stories you may have heard, though I suspect those stories have grown twisted with time and fear." Mira felt her pulse quicken, old warnings from childhood rising unbidden in her mind. Stories about shapes moving through the trees at Wolf Ridge, about a silence that swallowed sound whole. She looked down at the cub sleeping peacefully beside her, small and vulnerable, and found it difficult to reconcile that innocent creature with the fear those old stories had planted in her. "Am I in danger?" she asked carefully, meeting his gaze directly despite the unease coiling in her chest. "Not from me," Kale answered, his voice steady and sincere. "Not after what you did for Finn. But I will not lie to you. Not everyone in my pack shares my gratitude so easily. Trust between our kind and yours has never come simply, and for good reason. Our worlds have learned to survive by staying apart from one another." As if summoned by his words, a shuffling sound came from the entrance of the chamber, and Mira turned to see two more figures step into view. One was an older woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes that studied Mira with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The other was a younger man, broad-shouldered and clearly tense, his arms crossed over his chest as he regarded her with open suspicion. "This is Grace," Kale said, gesturing toward the older woman. "She tended to your injuries while you slept. And this is Owen, my second in command." Grace inclined her head politely, though her sharp eyes never stopped their careful assessment. "How are you feeling, child?" she asked, her voice carrying a warmth that eased some of the tension in Mira's chest. "Your body endured a great deal last night. It will take time to recover fully." "I feel strange," Mira admitted honestly. "Tired, sore, but grateful. Thank you for helping me." Grace's expression softened slightly at that, though Owen's posture remained rigid, his gaze flicking between Mira and Kale with obvious unease. "You should not be here," he said bluntly, his voice sharp enough to make Mira flinch slightly. "No offense intended toward your kindness with Finn, but every human who learns the truth about us becomes a risk to everyone in this den. History has proven that more times than I care to count." "Owen," Kale said, a warning edge entering his tone. "I am only speaking the truth," Owen replied, though he lowered his voice slightly, clearly unwilling to openly defy his alpha, but equally unwilling to stay silent. "You know what happened to the Ashwood pack when a human discovered their secret. You know how quickly gratitude can turn to fear, and fear to violence." Mira felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the fire, understanding the weight behind his words, even without knowing the specific history he referenced. She looked toward Kale, uncertain what to say. aware that her presence here had already created tension within a community she barely understood. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quietly. "If it's safer for everyone, I can leave. I just need to know my way back to the village." Kale studied her for a long moment before answering, something thoughtful passing behind his pale eyes. "You are in no condition to travel yet," he said finally. "Your body needs time to recover fully from what happened last night. And Finn has grown attached to you in a way that concerns me leaving unaddressed. She has not left your side since we brought you here." As if to confirm his words, the cub stirred at that moment, lifting her head sleepily, and immediately pressing closer against Mira's side, letting out a small, contented sound. Mira felt something warm unfold in her chest at the gesture, an unexpected connection to this small creature she had saved without any expectation of ever seeing it again. Owen made a low sound of frustration, but said nothing further, turning instead and stepping back toward the entrance, clearly displeased, but unwilling to press the argument further in front of his alpha. Grace remained a moment longer, checking Mira's pulse once more with gentle, practiced hands, before nodding in satisfaction.
"You are healing well,"
she said.
"Rest now. There will be time enough for questions and decisions once your strength has returned."
As Grace departed as well, leaving Mira alone with Kale and the sleeping cub, silence settled comfortably between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. Mira studied Kale carefully, trying to reconcile the danger implied by Owen's warnings with the quiet gentleness she had witnessed in his manner toward her since waking. "Why did you save me?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "Owen's right that it would have been simpler to leave me in the forest. No one would have known." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the fire rather than on her. "Because you saved something precious to me without any reason to do so," he said finally. "Because you risked everything for a creature you had never met, expecting nothing in return. That kind of selflessness deserves more than abandonment, regardless of the complications it creates." Mira felt something shift in her chest at his words, an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning nearby. She looked down at Finn, still curled trustingly against her side, and found herself smiling, despite the strangeness of her situation, despite the uncertainty of what came next. "I'm glad I found her in time," she said softly. "So am I," Kale answered, and something in his voice made her look up, catching an expression in his pale eyes that she could not quite name, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Outside the den, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and quiet, sunlight beginning to filter faintly through gaps in the clouds. But within the chamber, a different kind of storm had only just begun, one built from questions neither of them yet knew how to answer, and a connection neither of them had expected to form. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Mira could never have imagined only a week earlier. Her body healed steadily under Grace's careful attention, the exhaustion and soreness fading day by day, until she could move freely through the den, without the dizziness that had plagued her first attempts to stand. Finn remained a constant companion throughout her recovery, following her from chamber to chamber with the unwavering loyalty of a creature who considered her rescuer family, regardless of species or circumstance. Mira learned quickly that the pack operated with a structure far more complex than she had assumed from the outside. There were perhaps 30 members in total, ranging from elderly wolves like Grace, whose knowledge of healing herbs and old traditions commanded deep respect, to young ones barely older than Finn, still learning the boundaries of their abilities. Kale stood at the center of it all, not through fear or force, but through a quiet authority that seemed to draw genuine loyalty rather than mere obedience. Not everyone welcomed her presence easily. Owen remained distant and watchful, his suspicion never far from the surface, even as weeks passed without incident. Other members of the pack regarded her with similar caution, though a few, drawn perhaps by curiosity or by Finn's obvious attachment to her, began to warm gradually, offering small kindnesses that Mira treasured more than she expected to. One morning, as pale sunlight filtered through the entrance of the den, Mira found herself in the small clearing just beyond the hillside, watching as several young wolves practiced hunting techniques under the careful supervision of an older pack member. Finn sat beside her, watching the display with obvious longing, clearly eager to join despite still being too young for such training. "You want to try, don't you?" Mira said, glancing down at the cub with a smile. Finn made a small, frustrated sound, and Mira laughed softly, reaching out to scratch gently behind her ears. Your time will come. For now, you're still recovering too, just like me. A voice behind her made her turn, and she found Owen standing a short distance away, his expression as guarded as always, though something in his posture seemed slightly less rigid than usual. You handle her well, he said, nodding toward Finn. Better than most humans would manage, even those who claim to understand animals. I've spent years working with injured wildlife, Mira answered carefully, unsure whether this counted as an attempt at conversation or another test of her presence here. It's different with Finn, though. She's not just an animal to me anymore. Owen studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his sharp eyes. That is precisely what worries me, he said finally. Attachment complicates everything. It makes decisions harder to make when they need to be made clearly. What decisions? Mira asked, unable to keep a note of unease from entering her voice. Owen's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. There are pressures on this pack that predate your arrival, he said. Territory disputes with a neighboring pack that grow more serious each season. Kale carries the weight of protecting everyone here, and every new complication makes that weight heavier, whether or not it comes from ill intention. Mira absorbed this information slowly, understanding for the first time the deeper currents running beneath the surface of pack life, currents she had been too focused on her own recovery to notice fully until now. I don't want to make things harder for him, she said honestly. Or for anyone here. I believe that, Owen admitted, somewhat grudgingly. It does not change the difficulty of the situation, but perhaps it changes how I judge your presence here. Before Mira could respond, a commotion near the tree line drew both their attention. Several pack members had gathered around something at the edge of the clearing, their postures tense and alert. Owen moved quickly toward the group, and Mira followed, curiosity and concern overriding her usual caution about intruding on pack matters. At the center of the gathered wolves stood Kale, his expression grim as he examined a series of markings carved into the bark of a nearby tree. Mira recognized the symbols only vaguely, geometric patterns that meant nothing to her untrained eye, but the reaction from those around her told her clearly enough that their meaning carried weight. Victor's scouts have grown bold, Kale said, his voice low and controlled, despite the visible tension in his shoulders. This marking sits well within our territory, further than they have dared push before. What does it mean? Mira asked quietly, and several heads turned toward her, some surprised she had spoken up at all. It is a warning, Grace explained, stepping closer, her expression somber. Victor leads a pack from the northern ridge, one that has long resented the resources our territory provides. This marking means he intends to test our boundaries more directly than mere words. Kale's pale eyes met Mira's across the small crowd, something unreadable passing behind them. This does not concern you directly, he said, though his tone carried a gentleness that softened the words considerably. You need not worry over pack politics that predate your time here. Mira felt a flicker of something she could not quite name, a desire to be useful rather than simply protected, to contribute something meaningful to a community that had shown her such unexpected kindness. I know this forest better than you might think, she offered carefully. I've mapped much of the terrain for my rescue work over the years, including areas your pack might not frequent as often. If it would help to understand Victor's movements, I could share what I know. Several pack members exchanged glances at this offer, and Owen's expression shifted into something considering, rather than dismissive. It might prove useful, he admitted reluctantly. Human knowledge of the terrain differs from ours in ways that could reveal patterns we have overlooked. Kale studied Mira for a long moment, weighing something behind his thoughtful expression. Very well, he said finally. Walk with me. Show me what you know of the northern paths. As they moved away from the gathered pack, Finn trotting eagerly at their heels despite Grace's soft protest about her still healing leg, Mira found herself grateful for the chance to offer something in return for the kindness she had received. The forest stretched wide around them, familiar in ways that surprised her given how disoriented she had felt during the storm that first brought her here, and she pointed out landmarks and pathways as they walked, describing terrain features she had documented during years of tracking injured animals through these very woods. Kale listened with evident interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed a depth of tactical thinking she had not expected, weighing her observations against his own knowledge of the pack's territory with careful consideration. As the afternoon wore on, something had shifted subtly between them, a comfortable familiarity replacing the careful formality of their earlier interactions. "You surprise me," Cale said eventually, as they paused near a rocky outcropping that offered a wide view over the valley below. "Most humans who stumble into our world react with fear or fascination that clouds clear thinking. You have approached everything with remarkable steadiness." "I've spent my whole life caring for creatures who couldn't explain themselves to me," Mira answered thoughtfully. "Learning to read fear and trust in silence teaches you patience, I suppose. And besides, fear rarely helps solve anything. I'd rather understand a situation than simply panic over it." Cale's expression softened into something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile, an expression Mira realized she had not yet seen from him fully. "That is a rare quality," he said quietly. "One I find myself grateful for, more than I expected to be." The warmth in his voice sent an unexpected flutter through Mira's chest, and she found herself looking away, suddenly self-conscious under the intensity of his pale gaze. Below them, Finn chased after a fluttering leaf with clumsy enthusiasm, her earlier injury clearly healing well despite her youthful impatience with the pace of recovery. "We should head back before the light fades," Mira said finally, though something in her reluctant to end the moment lingered beneath the practical suggestion. Cale nodded, though his gaze remained on her a moment longer, before he turned to call Finn back toward them. As they made their way back toward the den, the conversation had shifted into easier territory. Questions about her work with wildlife, her life within the village, small details that built a picture of who she was, beyond the dramatic circumstances that had brought her into his world. By the time they reached the den entrance, the sky had deepened into shades of orange and purple, the first stars beginning to emerge overhead. Owen met them at the entrance, his expression still guarded, but noticeably less hostile than it had been that morning. "Did you learn anything useful?" he asked, addressing Cale directly, though his gaze flicked briefly toward Mira. "More than I expected to," Cale answered, and something in the way he said it made Mira's chest warm, with a feeling she was only beginning to understand. That night, as she settled into the furs within the chamber that had become hers during her recovery, Finn curled contentedly at her side. Mira found her thoughts returning again and again to the conversation on the ridge, to the unexpected warmth in Cale's pale eyes, to the strange, growing certainty that her life had changed in ways far more significant than simply surviving one dangerous storm. 3 days after the warning marking had been discovered along the northern boundary, tension within the den had grown thick enough to feel almost physical. Scouts returned throughout each day with fresh reports of Victor's pack pressing further into contested territory, testing boundaries that had held firm for years without serious challenge. Cale spent long hours in quiet consultation with Owen and several senior pack members, planning responses to a threat that seemed to grow more serious with each passing hour. Mira found herself drawn into these discussions more than she expected, her knowledge of the terrain proving useful in ways that gradually eroded even Owen's earlier skepticism about her presence. She had begun sketching rough maps from memory, marking pathways and water sources and hidden clearings that even some pack members had never fully explored, information gathered across years of tracking injured animals through every corner of these woods. "This ravine here," she said one afternoon, pointing to a section of her hand-drawn map spread across a flat stone table within the den's main chamber, "floods heavily whenever it rains for more than a day. If Victor's scouts are moving along the northern paths, they would likely avoid this route entirely, which means they are probably using the ridge trail instead, the one that stays dry even in bad weather." Cale studied the map carefully, tracing the ridge trail with one finger, understanding dawning in his expression. "This matches what our scouts reported yesterday," he said, glancing up at her with something like genuine admiration. "You have given us more clarity in an afternoon than weeks of scouting alone provided." Owen, standing nearby with arms crossed, nodded slowly, some of his lingering reservation finally giving way to grudging respect. "Perhaps there is more value in this arrangement than I first believed," he admitted, and Mira felt a small, satisfied warmth at finally earning something like trust from him. That evening, as the pack settled into an uneasy quiet, a young scout burst into the den entrance, breathless and clearly alarmed. Cale rose immediately, sensing sensing trouble before the scout even managed to speak. "Victor's wolves have crossed the ridge trail," the young scout reported, struggling to catch his breath. "They're moving toward the eastern watering hole, the one near the old stone circle. If they claim it, we lose access to clean water for the entire southern half of our territory." The chamber erupted into controlled but urgent motion, pack members gathering weapons and supplies with practiced efficiency. Kale's expression had hardened into something focused and commanding, every trace of the gentler man Mira had walked with on the ridge, replaced by the decisive leader his pack clearly depended upon during moments of crisis. "Owen, take 4 wolves and circle from the north," Kale instructed, his voice carrying easily through the chamber despite its controlled volume. "I will take the direct path with the rest. We intend to discourage this incursion, not provoke open conflict, but be prepared for either outcome." As the pack organized quickly around him, Mira found herself standing uncertainly near the edge of the activity, unsure of her place in a crisis clearly beyond her usual expertise. Kale's gaze found hers across the chamber, and something in his expression softened briefly despite the urgency of the moment. "Stay here," he said, moving closer. "This is not your fight, and I need to know you and Finn remain safe while we handle this." "I understand," Mira said, though something in her chest resisted the idea of simply waiting helplessly while others faced danger on her behalf. "Please be careful." Kale held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them before he turned and moved swiftly toward the entrance, the rest of the pack falling into formation behind him. Mira watched them disappear into the darkening forest, Finn pressing anxiously against her legs, both of them left behind in the sudden quiet that followed. The waiting proved far harder than Mira had anticipated. She paced the length of the main chamber repeatedly, Finn trailing after her with obvious anxiety of her own, both of them attuned to every distant sound that might signal the pack's return. Grace remained behind as well, tending to the youngest and oldest members of the pack, who had stayed within the safety of the den, but even her usual calm seemed strained as the hours stretched on without word. It was well past midnight when the first sounds of return reached the den, hurried footsteps and low voices carrying urgency that immediately set Mira's heart racing. She rushed toward the entrance alongside Grace, relief flooding through her at the sight of Kale's silhouette among the returning wolves, though that relief curdled instantly into alarm when she noticed the way he moved, one arm pressed tightly against his side, dark stains visible even in the dim light. "You're hurt," Mira said, rushing forward before she could think better of it, ignoring the surprised glances from several pack members at her open display of concern. "It looks worse than it is," Kale said, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. "Victor's wolves engaged more aggressively than we anticipated. We held the watering hole, but not without cost." Grace moved quickly to examine the wound, her expression grim as she assessed the damage. "This needs proper attention immediately," she said, already directing Kale toward the healing chamber with brisk efficiency. "The rest of you, tend to your own injuries and report fully once matters are settled here." Mira followed without being asked, unwilling to be sent away while Kale's condition remained uncertain, and something in his expression, when he noticed her presence, suggested he did not particularly want her to leave either. Grace worked quickly, cleaning and treating the wound along his ribs with practiced hands, occasionally murmuring instructions to Mira, who found herself assisting without hesitation, passing supplies and holding pressure where directed. "It was a clean fight, at least," Kale said through gritted teeth, as Grace worked, clearly trying to ease the tension in the room with dark humor. "Victor's second-in-command caught me with a poorly aimed strike that found more purchase than either of us expected." "That's not remotely reassuring," Mira said, though a small, relieved laugh escaped her despite the circumstances, watching as the wound finally began responding to Grace's careful treatment. As the immediate crisis settled and Grace finished her work, wrapping the wound securely and prescribing rest, the healing chamber gradually emptied of pack members, eager to check on their own injuries and share news of the encounter. Eventually, only Mira remained, seated close beside Kale, as exhaustion finally began settling visibly over him. "You didn't have to worry so much," Kale said quietly, watching her with an expression that held more warmth than the pain evident in his voice should have allowed. "I couldn't help it," Mira admitted honestly, surprising herself with the openness of her own words. "When I saw you injured, something in me just reacted before I could think about whether it was appropriate. Kale reached out slowly, his hand finding hers where it rested near the edge of the furs, his touch careful despite the obvious pain he still endured. "I am glad it did," he said softly. "I find myself thinking of you far more often than seems wise, given everything that separates our two worlds." Mira felt her breath catch slightly at his words, at the warmth of his hand around hers, at the vulnerability evident in his pale eyes despite his usual composed authority. "I think about you too," she admitted quietly. "More than I probably should, given how impossible this situation seems." "Impossible does not mean unwanted," Kale said, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against the back of her hand. "Whatever complications lie ahead, I find myself unwilling to pretend this connection between us does not exist." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had fully acknowledged until now, and Mira found herself leaning slightly closer before catching herself, suddenly aware of how quickly things had shifted between them since that first desperate night in the storm. Kale seemed to notice her hesitation and offered a small, understanding smile despite his exhaustion. "Rest now," he said gently. "There will be time enough to understand what this means for both of us once matters with Victor's pack settle more clearly." Mira nodded, though reluctance to leave his side lingered, as she finally rose and made her way back toward her own chamber, Finn waiting anxiously by the entrance to greet her. As she settled into the furs that night, sleep proved difficult to find, her mind replaying the warmth of Kale's touch, the sincerity in his pale eyes, the growing certainty that whatever separated their two worlds, something between them had already grown too significant to ignore. Outside, somewhere beyond the boundaries of the den, the forest remained restless with the aftermath of conflict, and though the immediate threat from Victor's pack had been repelled for now, an uneasy awareness settled over everyone that this confrontation marked only the beginning of a larger storm still gathering on the horizon. In the days following the confrontation at the watering hole, Kale's wound healed steadily under Grace's careful attention, though he moved with noticeably more caution than before, a reminder to the entire pack of how close the encounter had come to far worse consequences. Mira found herself spending increasing amounts of time near him during his recovery, their conversations deepening beyond practical matters of terrain and pack politics into something far more personal. She learned about his early years leading the pack, thrust into responsibility earlier than expected after his father's passing, the weight of protecting so many lives settling onto shoulders barely old enough to bear it. He learned about her own history, the loss of her parents years earlier that had first drawn her toward caring for creatures who could not fend for themselves, finding purpose in protecting the vulnerable, the way she wished someone had been able to protect her family. "You carry more responsibility than most people your age ever face," Kale observed one afternoon, as they sat together near the entrance of the den, watching Finn practice clumsy pounces on fallen leaves in the clearing beyond. "It shapes how you move through the world, I think. Careful, but never hesitant when it matters." Mira considered his words thoughtfully, watching Finn's enthusiastic, if uncoordinated hunting attempts, with a fond smile. "I suppose we have that in common," she said. "Both of us learned early that waiting for someone else to act isn't always an option." Their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed within the pack, and reactions remained mixed even as weeks passed, without further incident from Victor's territory. Some members, particularly the younger wolves who had bonded readily with Finn and, by extension with Mira, seemed to accept the developing relationship with genuine warmth. Others, Owen chief among them, maintained a watchful caution that Mira understood, even if it occasionally stung to notice. It was during one such afternoon, as Mira helped Grace sort through newly gathered herbs within the healing chamber, that Owen approached with an expression more serious than his usual guarded skepticism. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble, settling onto a nearby stone seat with obvious discomfort at the admission. "My suspicion toward you was not unfounded, given our history, but it has grown increasingly difficult to justify, given everything you have offered this pack since your arrival." Mira set aside the herbs she had been sorting, giving him her full attention. "You don't owe me anything, Owen," she said honestly. "Your caution made sense. I understand why trust doesn't come easily, especially given whatever happened to this Ashwood pack you mentioned before." Owen's expression grew somber at the reference, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "The Ashwood pack existed 2 generations before mine," he said finally. "A human discovered their secret much as you discovered ours, though under far less honorable circumstances." She used that knowledge to manipulate their trust, eventually leading hunters directly to their den. Few survived that betrayal. Mira felt a chill settle over her at the story, understanding suddenly the depth of the fear that had colored Owen's initial suspicion. Fear rooted in genuine tragedy, rather than simple prejudice. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "That must make trusting any human incredibly difficult." "It does," Owen agreed. "But you have proven yourself different across every test this pack has unintentionally set before you. Your knowledge helped us anticipate Victor's movements. Your care for Finn never wavered even once you understood the full truth of what she was. And your concern for Cale during his injury spoke to something far deeper than simple gratitude for the shelter you were given." Grace, who had been listening quietly while continuing her work, offered a small, knowing smile at this observation, though she said nothing, allowing Owen to continue his unexpected moment of openness. "I say this not simply as an apology," Owen continued, "but as a warning, born from genuine concern. Cale cares for you deeply, more than he has allowed himself to care for anyone since taking on leadership of this pack. If this connection between you continues to grow, it will create complications beyond simple pack politics. Some traditions run deep enough that even an alpha's wishes cannot easily overcome them." "What kind of complications?" Mira asked carefully, though something in her chest had already begun tightening in anticipation of an answer she suspected she would not welcome. "Bonds between our kind and yours are exceedingly rare," Owen explained, choosing his words with obvious care. "When they occur, they carry consequences neither party always anticipates. For Cale specifically, as Alpha, any bond he forms reflects on the entire pack's standing among other territories. Victor would seize upon such a connection as evidence of weakness, an opportunity to challenge boundaries even more aggressively than he already has." Mira absorbed this warning slowly, understanding the weight behind Owen's words even as something stubborn within her resisted the implication that she should distance herself from Cale to avoid these complications. "I never intended to cause difficulty for this pack," she said finally. "But I also can't pretend I don't care about him, Owen. That would be dishonest to everyone involved, including myself." Owen studied her for a long moment, something that might have been respect flickering behind his sharp eyes. "I did not expect you to retreat from the truth so directly," he admitted. "Perhaps that honesty is precisely why Cale finds himself drawn to you despite every complication it creates." That evening, as Mira walked alongside Cale through the quiet forest paths near the den, Finn trailing energetically ahead of them, she found herself sharing Owen's warning, unwilling to let unspoken concerns fester between them, when honesty had become the foundation of everything they had built together. "He's not wrong to worry," Cale admitted, once she had finished explaining the conversation. "Victor has grown increasingly aggressive precisely because he senses opportunities for weakness. A bond between myself and a human would give him exactly the justification he seeks to escalate matters further." "Does that mean we should stop this, whatever this is between us?" Mira asked, though the words felt heavy and reluctant even as she spoke them. Cale stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his pale eyes intense in the fading evening light. "I have led this pack for years, making decisions based purely on calculation and duty," he said quietly. "Every choice weighed against risk, every relationship measured against consequence. But since the night I found you in that storm, something has shifted within me that I cannot simply calculate away." He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek afterward. "I will not pretend the risks Owen describes are not real," he continued, "but I also will not pretend that walking away from you feels like any kind of solution worth pursuing. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I would rather face them with you beside me than retreat into safety that leaves us both diminished." Mira leaned into his touch, something warm and certain settling over the uncertainty that had gripped her chest since Owen's warning. "Then we face it together," she said softly. "Whatever Victor intends, whatever traditions complicate this, I'm not interested in pretending my feelings for you don't exist simply because they're inconvenient." Cale's expression softened into something that looked remarkably like relief, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, before finally closing the distance between them entirely. The kiss that followed felt like both an answer and a promise, gentle, despite the weight of everything unspoken, now finally acknowledged between them. When they finally separated, Finn had returned from her exploration to sit expectantly nearby, tilting her head with obvious curiosity at the scene before her, and both Mira and Kale laughed softly at the interruption, the tension of the evening's earlier conversation finally easing into something lighter and more hopeful. "Whatever Victor intends," Kale said finally, as they resumed their walk back toward the den, "we will face it as we have faced everything else, with clear thinking and mutual support, rather than fear driving our decisions." Mira nodded, though a small, persistent worry remained lodged in her chest, despite the warmth of the evening's revelations, an awareness that Owen's concerns, however painful to acknowledge, likely represented only the beginning of challenges still waiting to unfold in the days ahead. Grace found Mira alone near the small stream that ran along the eastern edge of the den's territory, filling water jugs for the evening meal, Finn splashing playfully nearby, despite Mira's repeated attempts to keep her paws dry. The older woman settled onto a nearby rock with a heaviness that suggested more than simple tiredness, and Mira set aside her work immediately, sensing something significant weighed on her mind. "There is something you should understand about Finn," Grace began, her gaze fixed thoughtfully on the cub splashing in the shallow water. "Something that explains far more than her simple charm, about why her survival that stormy night mattered so profoundly to this entire pack." Mira settled beside her, giving Grace her full attention, sensing the importance behind her careful tone. "I'm listening," she said simply. "Every generation, perhaps once in a lifetime if a pack is fortunate, a cub is born carrying what we call the old bloodline," Grace explained. "It manifests differently across different pups, sometimes as unusual strength, sometimes as an especially deep connection to the pack bond, sometimes in ways that only reveal themselves gradually over years. Finn carries this bloodline more strongly than any cub born in generations." "What does that mean exactly?" Mira asked, watching Finn chase a fallen leaf with fresh curiosity, now that she understood there was more to this small creature than simple playfulness. "It means her survival was never simply a matter of one life among many," Grace continued. "Packs carrying strong bloodlines tend to grow stronger themselves, more resilient against threats, better able to maintain their territory against encroachment from rivals like Victor. Finn represents not just a beloved cub, but potentially the future strength of this entire pack for generations to come." Mira absorbed this information slowly, understanding suddenly why Kale's connection to the cub had run so deep even before her rescue, why the pack's gratitude toward her had carried weight beyond simple appreciation for saving one small life. "Does Kale know all this?" she asked. "Of course," Grace said. "It is partly why he could not simply leave you in that storm, whatever risks bringing a human into our world might create. Finn's survival mattered too much to leave to chance, and your willingness to risk everything for her, without any knowledge of her significance, spoke to something Kale found impossible to ignore." As if drawn by the conversation, Finn abandoned her leaf chasing and trotted over, settling contentedly against Mira's side with a small, satisfied sigh. Mira reached down instinctively to stroke her soft fur, seeing the small cub now with fresh appreciation for everything she represented, not just to herself, but to an entire community she had grown to care for deeply. "Does Victor know about her bloodline?" Mira asked, a new worry forming as she considered the implications. Grace's expression grew grave at the question. "We believe he suspects," she admitted. "It would explain his increasingly aggressive movements against our territory in recent months, testing our boundaries in ways he never attempted before Finn's birth. If he confirmed his suspicions fully, I fear his aggression would only intensify further, understanding that eliminating or capturing her would deal our pack a blow from which we might never fully recover." The weight of this revelation settled heavily over Mira as she considered everything it implied, the stakes of the ongoing tension with Victor's pack suddenly clarifying into something far more dangerous than simple territorial disputes. That night, as she found herself walking alongside Kale once more, she shared what Grace had told her, watching his expression carefully as she spoke. "I should have told you sooner," Kale admitted once she had finished, guilt evident in his tone. "I did not want to burden you with the full weight of what you had unknowingly become entangled in, but keeping this from you was perhaps a mistake, given everything else we have built together." "I understand why you hesitated," Mira said gently, "though I would rather know the full truth than be protected from complications that affect all of us, regardless of what I know or don't know." Kale nodded slowly, something resolved settling into his expression. Then know this as well, he said. Victor has grown bolder in recent days, beyond simple territorial testing. Our scouts report increased movement along multiple fronts, patterns that suggest he may be preparing for something far more significant than another simple skirmish over water rights. A chill settled over Mira at this news, memories of Kale's injury from their last encounter with Victor's forces still vivid in her mind. What are you going to do? She asked. Prepare, Kale answered simply. Strengthen our defenses, coordinate more closely with allied packs who share concerns about Victor's growing aggression, and remain vigilant against any attempt he might make to act on his suspicions about Finn's significance. Their conversation was interrupted by hurried footsteps approaching through the darkness, and both turned to find Owen approaching with an expression tighter than his usual guarded caution, something that looked distinctly like alarm evident beneath his controlled demeanor. We have a problem, Owen said without preamble, his gaze flicking briefly toward Mira before settling on Kale. Information about our territory patterns, our defensive positions, details that only pack members would know, has apparently reached Victor's forces. Our scouts intercepted a message confirming it. Kale's expression darkened considerably at this revelation. A traitor within our own ranks, he said, more statement than question, though the implications clearly troubled him deeply. It seems so, Owen confirmed grimly. I have my suspicions about who might be responsible, though nothing confirmed enough yet to act upon directly. Who do you suspect? Kale asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger at the betrayal this news represented. Owen hesitated, glancing again toward Mira before answering, and something in that hesitation made Mira's stomach tighten uncomfortably. Daniel has been seen near the northern boundary more frequently than his usual duties require, Owen said carefully. And his mate comes from a family with old grievances against your father's leadership, grievances that predate your own time as Alpha. Kale's jaw tightened at this information, clearly troubled by the implications regarding a pack member he had presumably trusted for years. I will not act on suspicion alone, he said finally, but we will watch him carefully and reinforce our defenses regardless of who bears responsibility for this leak. As Owen departed to organize additional patrols, Kale turned back to Mira, exhaustion and worry evident in his expression despite his controlled composure. This complicates everything, he admitted quietly. If Victor knows our defensive weaknesses in addition to suspecting Finn's significance, his next move could come far sooner and far more dangerously than we anticipated. What can I do to help? Mira asked, unwilling to simply watch from the sidelines while danger gathered around everyone she had come to care for so deeply. Stay close to Finn, Kale said, reaching out to take her hand gently despite the tension evident in his grip. If Victor moves against us directly, she will be his primary target. Your knowledge of the terrain, combined with your bond with her, might prove essential if we need to protect her through unconventional means. Mira nodded firmly, understanding the weight of responsibility being entrusted to her, and something in her chest hardened with determination rather than fear. I won't let anything happen to her, she said. Whatever Victor intends, I'll do everything in my power to keep her safe. Kale studied her for a long moment, something like gratitude and affection mixing behind his pale eyes, despite the gravity of their conversation. I know you will, he said softly. That certainty is perhaps the only comfort I can find amid everything else threatening to unravel around us. As they made their way back toward the den beneath a sky heavy with clouds that promised another storm before morning, Mira found herself reflecting on how quickly her life had transformed since that first desperate night chasing a cub's cry through the rain. She had found not just purpose and connection in this unexpected world, but responsibility and danger that now threatened everyone and everything she had grown to treasure. Whatever Victor was planning, whatever betrayal had compromised the pack's defenses from within, she understood with growing certainty that the coming days would test everything she had built here, in ways far more serious than anything she had faced before, and she found herself determined, despite the fear coiling beneath her resolve, to meet that challenge with everything she had left to give. The days that followed passed in a haze of preparation, the entire den transformed by a sense of urgency that touched every member of the pack, regardless of age or rank. Kale called upon allied packs from neighboring territories, wolves who had maintained peaceful relations across generations, and who now recognized the threat Victor's growing aggression posed to the broader balance of the region. Mira watched as strangers arrived over the following days, some cautious around her presence, others more accepting once they understood the role she had played in protecting Finn. Owen coordinated defensive positions throughout the territory with methodical precision, marking vulnerable points along the boundary that would need reinforcement, organizing patrol rotations that ensured no section of their land went unwatched for long. Daniel, the pack member Owen had suspected of betrayal, had been quietly monitored throughout this period, though no further evidence had emerged to confirm or deny his involvement, leaving the question of the traitor's identity frustratingly unresolved. Mira found herself contributing wherever her particular knowledge proved useful, sketching detailed maps of terrain features that might offer tactical advantages, identifying water sources and hidden pathways that could prove essential if the pack needed to move quickly or establish emergency shelter. Grace kept her supplied with herbs and remedies, teaching her enough of their healing traditions that she could assist meaningfully if injuries occurred during whatever confrontation lay ahead. Through it all, Finn remained blissfully unaware of the gravity surrounding her significance, continuing her playful exploration of the den's surroundings with the innocent enthusiasm of any young creature, though Mira noticed she rarely strayed far from either herself or Kale during this tense period, as though some instinctive awareness told her that safety lay closest to those who cared for her most deeply. It was during a quiet evening, as the pack settled into an uneasy rest after another long day of preparation, that Mira found herself alone with Kale, near the small fire at the center of the main chamber, both of them exhausted but unable to fully surrender to sleep, given the weight of uncertainty hanging over everyone. "Do you think we're ready?" Mira asked quietly, watching the flames dance across Kale's tired features. "As ready as we can be, given the circumstances," Kale answered honestly. "Victor commands a larger pack than ours, but our allies strengthen our position considerably, and our knowledge of this terrain, thanks in no small part to your contributions, gives us advantages he may not fully anticipate." Mira reached for his hand, finding comfort in the familiar warmth of his touch despite the anxiety coiling in her chest. "I'm scared," she admitted honestly, something she had avoided voicing clearly, until this quiet moment allowed the vulnerability to surface. "Not just for myself, but for you, for Finn, for everyone here who has become so important to me." Kale turned to face her fully, his expression softening with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I am frightened as well," he admitted, an honesty she suspected he rarely allowed himself with others. "Not of Victor's forces directly, but of losing what we have built together before we have had the chance to fully explore what it might become." He reached up, gently cupping her face in his hands, his pale eyes searching hers with something that looked remarkably like desperate hope. "Whatever happens in the coming days," he said quietly, "I need you to know that finding you that night in the storm changed everything about how I understand my own life. You have given me something I did not know I was missing, a connection that goes beyond duty or obligation, into something I can only describe as belonging." Mira felt tears gathering unexpectedly at his words, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion he had allowed himself to reveal, despite the danger surrounding them. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "Before that night, I thought my purpose was simply helping creatures who couldn't help themselves. But you, this pack, Finn, all of it has shown me a kind of belonging I never knew I was searching for either." Their lips met in a kiss far more urgent than the gentle exchange they had shared weeks earlier, charged now with the desperate awareness that time might not offer them the luxury of a slow, careful courtship free from danger. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Kale rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the tension gripping his shoulders. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "promise me you will stay safe. Trust Owen's guidance if I cannot be near you directly. Protect Finn above all else, but protect yourself as well. I could not bear losing you now, not after everything we have found together." "I promise," Mira said, though the words felt heavy, with an uncertainty neither of them could fully dismiss. "But you need to promise the same to me. Don't take unnecessary risks trying to protect everyone else. This pack needs you, and so do I." Kale's expression grew solemn at her request, and for a moment, she feared he might refuse to make a promise he could not guarantee to keep, given his responsibilities as Alpha. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I will do everything within my power to return to you," he said. "That is the most honest promise I can offer, given what may lie ahead." Their quiet moment was interrupted by urgent footsteps, and both turned to find a young scout rushing into the chamber, breathless and clearly alarmed, echoing the same urgency that had marked the night of their first confrontation with Victor's forces weeks earlier. "Victor's forces are moving," the scout reported, struggling to catch his breath. "Multiple groups, converging from different directions. This is not another simple boundary test. This looks like a coordinated assault." Kale rose immediately, the vulnerability of moments before replaced instantly by the focused authority his role demanded. "Sound the alarm," he commanded. "Gather everyone to defensive positions immediately. Owen, coordinate with our allies at the eastern boundary. This is what we have been preparing for." As the chamber erupted into organized chaos, pack members moving swiftly to their assigned positions, Mira found herself pulled instinctively toward where Finn slept, determined to fulfill her promise to keep the cubs safe, regardless of what chaos erupted around them. Grace appeared at her side moments later, her expression grim but steady, ready to assist however needed. "This is really happening," Mira said, more to herself than to Grace, as she gathered Finn carefully into her arms, the cub waking groggily, and immediately sensing the tension surrounding her. "It is," Grace confirmed, her voice steady, despite the gravity of the moment. "Stay close to me. We will move to the reinforced chamber deeper within the hillside, the position best protected against any breach of our outer defenses." As they hurried through the den's winding passages, Finn clutched tightly against her chest. Mira caught one final glimpse of Kale near the entrance, directing pack members with calm, decisive authority, despite the danger clearly gathering beyond the tree line. Their eyes met briefly across the chaos, and something passed between them, unspoken, but powerfully felt, a promise renewed silently, amid the urgency of preparation, for whatever confrontation the night ahead held in store. Then he turned back toward the entrance, disappearing into the darkness beyond, and Mira forced herself to follow Grace, deeper into the protected chambers, her heart pounding with fear not for herself, but for everyone she had grown to love within this unexpected world that had become, against every reasonable expectation, the place she now called home. The sounds of conflict reached even the deepest chambers of the den, muffled but unmistakable, growls and howls mixing with the crash of bodies against earth and stone somewhere beyond the protective hillside. Mira sat pressed against the far wall of the reinforced chamber, Finn trembling in her arms despite her best efforts to offer comfort, Grace nearby tending to the small group of elderly and young pack members who had been gathered here for safety. "How long has it been?" Mira asked quietly, unable to judge the passage of time within the enclosed space, every distant sound of battle stretching each minute into what felt like an eternity of uncertainty. "Perhaps an hour," Grace answered, her own composure clearly strained despite her attempts to remain steady, for the sake of those around her. "Long enough that I fear this confrontation has grown more serious than even our preparations anticipated." A young pack member near the chamber entrance suddenly straightened, his ears twitching toward sounds only he could clearly detect. "Something's changed," he said, alarm evident in his voice. "The fighting has moved closer, much closer than before." Grace rose immediately, moving toward the entrance with careful caution, and Mira found herself following despite every instinct urging her to remain hidden with Finn, in the relative safety of the deeper chamber. What she saw through the narrow passage leading toward the den's main entrance made her blood run cold. Victor's forces had breached the outer defenses. Wolves moved through the smoke and chaos beyond the entrance, some clearly belonging to Kale's pack, others unfamiliar, and fighting with a ferocity that spoke to Victor's determination to succeed regardless of cost. Mira caught a glimpse of Owen near the entrance, blood matting his fur, fighting alongside two other pack members against a trio of Victor's wolves pressing forward with relentless aggression. "We need to move deeper," Grace said urgently, already turning back toward the protected chamber. "This position is no longer secure enough." But even as she spoke, a new sound reached them, one that made Mira's heart seize with terror, a distinctive howl, different from the others, carrying a note of triumph that sent chills through everyone who heard it. Grace's expression turned ashen. "That is Victor," she said quietly. "He has broken through." The chamber erupted into controlled panic, pack members scrambling to establish a final defensive line around the vulnerable members still sheltered within. Mira held Finn tightly against her chest, the cub whimpering with obvious fear, sensing the danger even without fully understanding its source. Through the chaos, Mira's mind raced, searching desperately for some way to protect the small creature depending on her, remembering suddenly the terrain knowledge she had shared during those quiet planning sessions weeks earlier. "There's another way out," she said suddenly, grabbing Grace's arm with urgent insistence. "A narrow passage near the eastern wall, one I noticed during my recovery here, that leads to a hidden ravine outside the main den structure. If Victor has broken through the front, we might still escape through there." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply, trusting Mira's knowledge despite the uncertainty of the plan. "Show me," she said, quickly gathering the small group of vulnerable pack members toward the passage Mira indicated. As they moved swiftly through the narrow tunnel, Finn clutched protectively against her chest. Mira's mind remained fixed on Kale, fighting somewhere in the chaos beyond, and she found herself praying with desperate intensity that her earlier promise, to trust Owen's guidance and protect herself and Finn above all else, would somehow allow her the chance to see him again, once this confrontation finally ended. The passage opened into a narrow ravine hidden behind a thick cluster of brush, exactly as Mira remembered from her exploration during the quieter days of her recovery. The sounds of battle remained audible even here, though muffled by distance and the surrounding rock formations. Grace immediately began organizing the group, positioning the most vulnerable members deeper within the ravine's natural shelter. "We should be safe here for now," Grace said, though tension remained evident in every line of her posture. "But we cannot stay indefinitely. If Victor's forces locate this position, we will have nowhere left to retreat." As if summoned by her words, a rustling sound from the brush at the ravine's entrance sent every head snapping toward the disturbance, and Mira's heart lodged painfully in her throat as a figure emerged, breathing hard, blood visible against a torn shoulder. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Owen, though his obvious injuries tempered that relief with fresh concern. "You found the eastern passage," he said, clearly relieved to discover the group safely hidden despite his own evident exhaustion. "Good. Victor's forces control most of the main entrance now. Kale is holding them back with what remains of our strongest fighters, but the odds have grown increasingly difficult." "Is he all right?" Mira asked immediately, unable to keep the desperate worry from her voice. "He was fighting when I left to search for survivors," Owen answered honestly, though something in his expression suggested he was withholding the full severity of the situation to avoid causing further panic among the sheltered group. "But Mira, there is something else you should know. Victor has specifically demanded Finn be surrendered to him. He knows about her bloodline for certain now, and he has made clear he intends to claim her regardless of what resistance our pack offers." A cold, hard resolve settled over Mira, despite the fear still coursing through her chest. "He won't get her," she said firmly, holding Finn even more protectively against herself. "I promised Kale I would keep her safe, and I intend to keep that promise no matter what it requires." Owen studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect passing behind his tired eyes despite the dire circumstances surrounding them. "Then we need a plan beyond simply hiding," he said. "If Victor's forces locate this ravine, hiding alone will not be enough to protect her." As they discussed possible options in hurried, urgent tones, a new sound reached them, closer than before, the distinctive crash of bodies moving through brush, accompanied by low, threatening growls. Owen's expression hardened immediately, positioning himself protectively between the entrance and the sheltered group. "They've found us," he said grimly, just as several shapes emerged from the tree line surrounding the ravine. Wolves bearing Victor's markings, their postures aggressive and clearly intent on claiming what they had come searching for. Mira's breath caught as she recognized the largest among them, unmistakably Victor himself, his presence radiating a cold authority that made even Owen's defensive stance seem uncertain by comparison. Victor's gaze swept across the sheltered group before settling with clear, calculating interest on Finn, still clutched protectively in Mira's arms. "Give me the cub," Victor said, his voice carrying a chilling calm, despite the violence evident in his posture. "And this can end without further bloodshed. Resist, and I promise you will not enjoy the consequences." Owen stepped forward despite his obvious injuries, positioning himself firmly between Victor and the group he had sworn to protect. "You will have to go through me first," he said, his voice steady despite the clear disadvantage he faced against Victor's superior numbers. The confrontation that followed happened almost too quickly for Mira to fully process. Owen engaging the nearest of Victor's wolves with fierce determination, while Grace hurried the vulnerable pack members further back into the ravine's protective shelter. Mira found herself frozen for a critical moment, torn between the instinct to flee and the desperate need to help however she could. Then, from somewhere beyond the chaos, a familiar howl cut through the confusion, carrying an authority that made even Victor's forces pause momentarily in their advance. Kale burst into the clearing moments later, several loyal pack members close behind him, his expression fierce with a protective fury that Mira had never witnessed from him before. "This ends now," Kale said, positioning himself directly before Victor, with unmistakable challenge evident in every line of his tense posture. "You will not touch her, and you will not touch anyone under my protection." Victor's expression twisted into something between amusement and genuine anger at this direct challenge. "Your pack grows weaker with every season, Kale," he said mockingly. "Perhaps it is time for stronger leadership to claim what your weakness cannot adequately protect." The confrontation that followed unfolded with a speed and violence that left Mira breathless with terror, Kale and Victor clashing directly, while their respective pack members engaged around them in smaller, equally desperate confrontations. Mira pressed herself and Finn back against the ravine wall, watching helplessly as Owen fought off a second attacker, blood now flowing freely from a fresh wound along his flank. The tide of battle seemed to shift back and forth in agonizing uncertainty, Kale's superior knowledge of the terrain offering some advantage against Victor's greater size and aggression, but the outcome remained desperately uncertain, even as minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity of chaos and violence. It was in a moment of sudden opportunity, as Victor lunged aggressively toward Kale with what appeared to be a decisive strike, that Mira noticed something the fighting wolves themselves seemed too focused to catch. A loose section of rock face above the ravine, weakened perhaps by the storm weeks earlier, had begun shifting dangerously under the vibration of the ongoing conflict. "Kale, watch above you!" Mira screamed, with every bit of desperate urgency she could summon. The warning came just in time. Kale twisted sharply away from Victor's strike, narrowly avoiding both his opponent's attack and the sudden collapse of loose stone that crashed down precisely where he had been standing moments before. Victor, caught off guard by both the near miss and the unexpected warning that had saved his rival, hesitated for one critical second. That hesitation proved decisive. Kale, capitalizing on the opening created by the collapsing rock, pressed his advantage with renewed intensity, finally forcing Victor into a defensive retreat that quickly spread through the remainder of his forces as they recognized the shifting momentum of the confrontation. Within minutes, what had begun as a desperate, uncertain battle transformed into a clear victory for Kale's pack. Victor's remaining forces retreating hastily into the surrounding forest, rather than risk further losses against opponents who had proven far more resilient than anticipated. As the immediate danger finally passed, Kale turned back toward the ravine, his expression shifting from fierce determination to desperate relief as he confirmed Mira and Finn remained safe within the shelter. He crossed the distance between them quickly, pulling both Mira and the trembling cub into a fierce, protective embrace that spoke to every fear he had carried throughout the confrontation. "You saved my life," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion as he held her close. "That warning gave me exactly the opening I needed." "I couldn't lose you," Mira answered, her own voice unsteady with the release of tension that had gripped her throughout the desperate confrontation. "Not after everything we've found together." Around them, the pack began the slow process of tending to injuries and confirming everyone's safety, the aftermath of battle, settling into something more manageable, now that the immediate threat had finally passed. Owen approached, favoring his injured side but alive and clearly relieved at the outcome of the confrontation, and Kale reached out to grip his shoulder firmly, in silent gratitude for his fierce defense of the sheltered group. "Victor will not forget this defeat easily," Owen warned, though relief was evident beneath his cautious tone. "But for tonight, at least, we have protected what matters most." Kale nodded, his gaze returning to Mira and the cub still held securely between them. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Tonight, we have protected everything that matters most." In the weeks that followed the confrontation with Victor's forces, the den slowly returned to a rhythm of peaceful recovery, the urgent tension that had gripped every member of the pack gradually easing into something approaching normalcy once more. Injuries healed under Grace's careful attention, Damaged sections of the outer defenses were repaired and reinforced against future threats, and the pack began the careful work of rebuilding trust and stability after the trauma of open conflict. Victor's forces had retreated fully to their northern territory, following their decisive defeat, and reports from allied packs suggested internal challenges to his leadership had emerged in the aftermath, weakened by the failure of his aggressive campaign and the losses his pack had suffered. Whether this meant a lasting peace or simply a temporary reprieve remained uncertain, but for now, the immediate threat that had hung over the den for so many tense weeks had finally lifted. Mira found herself settling into her place within the pack, with a certainty that surprised her, given how impossible her situation would have seemed only months earlier. She continued contributing her knowledge of the terrain to the pack's ongoing security, but increasingly, her role had expanded beyond simple tactical usefulness into something that felt more like genuine belonging. Grace had begun teaching her more extensively about healing traditions, finding in Mira an eager and capable student. Even Owen, whose earlier suspicion had given way entirely to genuine friendship, sought out her company regularly, their shared experience during the confrontation with Victor having forged a bond neither had anticipated. Finn, meanwhile, had grown noticeably in both size and confidence since the dangerous night of her rescue. Her earlier injury fully healed, her clumsy enthusiasm gradually maturing into the beginnings of genuine grace and skill. She remained devoted to Mira with unwavering loyalty, though she had also grown close to Kale in ways that spoke to the deep significance of the bond between Alpha and Cub that Grace had described so many weeks earlier. One quiet evening, as autumn began settling gently over the forest, painting the leaves in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Mira found herself walking alongside Kale toward the same rocky outcropping where they had first shared a meaningful conversation about the pack's terrain and defenses. Finn trotted ahead of them, no longer the fragile, injured creature Mira had carried through a storm, but a young wolf growing steadily into her own strength and confidence. "It's hard to believe how much has changed since that first night," Mira said softly, watching the sunset paint brilliant colors across the valley spread below them. Kale reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a familiarity that had become as natural as breathing over the months since their bond had first formed. "I find myself grateful every day for the storm that brought you to us," he said quietly. "Though I would never wish such danger upon you, everything that followed from that night has given me a life I did not know I was missing." Mira leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched Finn chase after a fluttering moth with playful enthusiasm below them. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I came into this forest looking for a lost cub, and somehow I found an entire family I never knew I needed." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the last light of evening fade gradually into the soft glow of emerging stars overhead. Below them, the den remained quiet and peaceful, the pack settling into evening routines that spoke to a stability hard-won through the trials of recent months. Owen approaches slowly along the ridge trail, joining them with the easy familiarity that had grown between the three of them since the confrontation with Victor's forces. "Grace tells me the eastern boundary repairs are finally complete," he reported, though his tone carried more relaxed satisfaction than the urgent concern that had characterized his reports throughout the tense weeks before. "It seems, for now at least, we have earned ourselves a period of genuine peace." "That is welcome news indeed," Kale answered, though something thoughtful lingered in his expression as he watched Finn continue her playful exploration below them. "Though I suspect peace, however welcome, rarely lasts indefinitely in a world such as ours." "Perhaps not," Owen agreed, "but we have proven, through everything Victor's aggression forced upon us, that this pack possesses a strength and resilience that should discourage future challengers from underestimating us again." Mira smiled softly at this exchange, appreciating how far their relationship had evolved from Owen's initial deep suspicion toward her presence within the pack. "Whatever challenges the future holds," she said, "I believe we're better prepared to face them together than we would have been facing them apart." As if in agreement, Finn chose that moment to bound back up the ridge toward them, pressing affectionately against Mira's legs, before turning to do the same with Kale, her small tail wagging with obvious contentment despite the growing darkness settling over the forest around them. Owen watched the display with something like genuine warmth in his usually guarded expression, a stark contrast to the wary distrust that had marked his earliest interactions with Mira so many months earlier. She has grown so much since that storm, Owen observed. It is remarkable to consider how differently everything might have unfolded if you had not found the courage to venture into this forest that night, despite every warning your village had taught you about this place. I never really considered not going, Mira admitted honestly. Something about that cry just called to me, in a way I couldn't ignore, even knowing the risks involved. Cale squeezed her hand gently at this admission, his pale eyes warm with an affection that had only deepened through everything they had faced together. That selflessness is precisely what drew me to you from that very first night, he said softly. Not just your courage, though that mattered deeply, but the genuine care that drove you to risk everything for a creature you had never even met. As the last light of evening finally faded completely into darkness, the three of them made their way back toward the den, Finn trotting contentedly alongside them, her earlier fragility transformed now into the confident bearing of a young wolf, secure in the knowledge of her family's protection. Inside the den, warm firelight greeted them, along with the comfortable sounds of pack life settling into evening routines, laughter and quiet conversation carrying through chambers that had, months earlier, seemed so foreign and uncertain to Mira. Grace met them near the entrance, her expression carrying the same warmth that had characterized her care for Mira since that very first desperate night of recovery from the storm's near-fatal cold. "The evening meal is ready," she announced, "and I believe the entire pack would welcome your company at the gathering tonight." As they settled among the pack members gathered around the central fire, sharing food and stories that had become a cherished tradition throughout the difficult months of preparation and conflict, Mira found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered this forest as a stranger, guided only by instinct and compassion toward a creature in desperate need of rescue. She had found herself, instead, discovering an entire world she never knew existed, a connection with Cale that had grown into something profound and lasting, and a place within a community that had come to feel, against every reasonable expectation, exactly like home. Later that night, as the gathering finally wound down and pack members retreated to their respective chambers for rest, Cale walked Mira back toward the chamber that had become hers over the months since her recovery. Finn already curled contentedly among the furs, exhausted from her evening's playful exploration. "Thank you," Cale said quietly, pausing at the entrance to her chamber, "for choosing to stay, despite everything that choice has required you to face alongside us." Mira reached up, gently cupping his face in her hands, meeting his pale eyes with the same certainty that had guided her through every difficult moment since that fateful storm. "I didn't choose to stay simply because it was required of me," she said softly. "I chose to stay because somewhere along this journey, this became exactly where I belonged." Cale leaned down slowly, capturing her lips in a gentle kiss that carried none of the desperate urgency of their earlier exchange amid the chaos of battle, but instead something steadier, more certain, a promise renewed now in the peaceful aftermath of everything they had overcome together. When they finally separated, his expression held a warmth and contentment that spoke more clearly than any words could of the future he envisioned for them both. "Then let us build that belonging together," he said softly, "for as long as this life allows us." Outside, the forest settled into peaceful quiet beneath a sky scattered with countless stars. The storm that had first brought Mira into this unexpected world long since passed, leaving behind not destruction, but the foundation of something enduring and precious. Within the den, wrapped in the warmth of firelight and the comfort of a family found in the most unexpected of circumstances, Mira finally allowed herself to fully embrace the life she had stumbled into that stormy night, grateful beyond measure for the small, desperate cry that had led her, against every warning and every fear, exactly where she was always meant to be.